Twisted Case. Subscribe if you want human-first, evidence-driven true crime. A doorbell chimes inside a modest Norwalk home. A porch light cuts a thin triangle across a driveway. A tenant hits record on his phone because the arguments keep getting louder. Within minutes, one of them will be dead. The other will call 911. Kurt Lametta was 54. He lived in a small place on Nelson Avenue in Norwalk, Connecticut. He worked odd jobs, fixed what he could, and kept receipts in a kitchen drawer that stuck in damp weather. Friends knew him as talkative and stubborn in equal measure. Pandemic years were hard. Work came and went. Rent fell behind. Pride made negotiations bumpy. He didn't want charity, he wanted time. Ellen Wink was 65 by sentencing. In Norwalk, her name meant civic process. She'd been a deputy registrar of voters and stayed active in local Republican politics. People familiar with City Hall recognized her as persistent and organized, sometimes rigid. She also owned property. At one of those addresses, 16 Nelson Avenue, she was the landlord and Kurt was the tenant. What began as a standard rental relationship turned into an exhausting, personal dispute that stretched across the pandemic and well beyond it. Reporters and prosecutors later traced the friction back to 2020, when rent arrears started piling up under COVID-19 protections, tensions that never truly reset when moratoriums eased. Neighbors heard arguments through walls, hot words about money, repairs, and who had the right to be where. Police were called more than once. Court papers show the city warned Wink not to contact her tenant directly in the year leading up to the shooting. That advice didn't hold. The conflict moved from paperwork to doorways, from notices to confrontations. By late 2021, something else changed. According to records and later testimony, Wink tried to lock Kurt out and dispose of his belongings, a criminal lockout allegation and charge that would become part of the larger case. What should have been a civil process, slow, frustrating, but contained, was sliding toward personal enforcement. You'll hear a judge later say exactly that. This belonged in housing court, not in a confrontation. Kurt did one thing that would echo through the trial. He began recording key interactions on his phone. When people feel outmatched by leverage or titles, they turn to documentation. A blinking red dot became his way to build a timeline that couldn't be argued away. That choice, to press record, would become the spine of the state's case. You're watching Twisted Case. We center people first and follow the evidence where it goes. If that's how you want true crime told, subscribe now and stay for the dilemma at the end. January 20th, 2022. It was winter clear and dry in Norwalk. The temperature sat low enough that breath showed outside, but the house held that still, closed-up chill. At some point that day, the simmering dispute boiled over. What happened in those minutes would be argued for years, but the broad outlines aren't in dispute. There was a confrontation at 16 Nelson Avenue. Words were exchanged. Positions shifted. A firearm was present. Winks. The tenant's phone was rolling. Prosecutors would later say the recording captured not just voices, but a sequence, movements, a pause, and multiple shots fired. Kurt was hit and collapsed. Wink called 911, identified herself, and reported the situation. Police and EMS arrived. Kurt did not survive. From the first hour, there were two stories. Wink told investigators she had acted in self-defense. She said she was afraid and fired to stop an attack. The official response preserved that claim as a possibility, but detectives collected evidence at the scene and secured the phone. The device didn't care about politics, reputation, or who had keys to the house. It just offered sound, seconds apart, with no opinion. Over time, that audio would take center stage. The defense story was direct. A landlord under stress, dealing with a tenant who hadn't paid rent, had damaged the property, and it frightened her. A split-second decision inside a chaotic encounter, and a woman who believed she had no other choice left. A clinical psychologist, Dr. Jessica Pearson, later testified that Wink suffered from adjustment disorder, profound distress, insomnia, and fear in the months leading up to the shooting. That testimony aimed at extreme emotional disturbance, an alternative to straight murder, or at least a frame that reduced moral blame. The state's story hardened in the months that followed. Prosecutors highlighted the criminal lockout incident before the shooting and asserted a pattern of threats and pressure. They pointed to the phone recording, arguing it contradicted any notion of an immediate, advancing threat. They told jurors the audio captured a sequence inconsistent with panic and consistent with control. They also presented internet searches, terms related to ammunition and lethal force in the days leading up to January 20th. Layer by layer, they framed an escalation not forced by danger, but chosen in anger. There were additional wrinkles. A body camera clip caught a lead investigator using the word insane about Wink, loose language that defense attorneys used to challenge the state's tone. And the city would later defend itself in a separate wrongful death suit alleging a slow police response, an allegation the city rejected by arguing the fatal harm happened before any 911 delay could have changed the outcome. These threads colored public perception, but they did not move the central pillars of the criminal case. If a confrontation is truly life or death in the moment, should the audio feel ordered? Or can fears still sound controlled? That became the pivot at trial. Wink was charged with murder and criminal lockout. Pre-trial hearings stretched through 2024 into 2025. There were negotiations. At one point, a plea offer reportedly around 40 years was on the table. She did not take it. The defense filed notices preserving possible self-defense, insanity, and extreme emotional disturbance claims. The judge required disclosure of the expert's methodology. The state prepared to walk jurors through a timeline. COVID arrears, lockout, threats, recording, shots. The defense prepared to widen that frame. Context, fear, mental strain, and a tenant they framed as volatile. In June 2025, the case went before a Stanford Superior Court jury. The courtroom was bright, the air a little too cold. Reporters filled the press row. Family members filled hard benches. The prosecution's task was classic but heavy. Make the audio, the timeline, and the digital trail tell one coherent story. Murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense's task was to carve out enough uncertainty to land on self-defense, or at least on extreme emotional disturbance, which would drop the charge to first-degree manslaughter with a firearm if accepted. The phone recording mattered most. Jurors listened to words and to the space between them. Prosecutors argued that space proved deliberation, a gap, then additional shots. Visuals from the scene and diagrams helped the jury map voices to positions. The state said the victim was not advancing when the fatal shots were fired. The defense attacked that interpretation, insisting that snippets couldn't capture the fear in the room or the context of long-running harassment and damage to the home. The state also walked jurors through search history, suggesting research on ammunition with higher lethality. That kind of evidence has power because it appears to show planning. The defense pushed back, arguing that knowledge about weapons does not equal intent to kill unlawfully, especially for someone who believes she might need to defend herself. Character witnesses split along predictable lines. Some described Wink as civic-minded and precise, someone unlikely to explode without cause. Others described rising hostility and a landlord who crossed procedural lines long before that day. A detective's ill-chosen insane comment on body cam, admitted over an objection, briefly reoriented attention to police tone, yet the judge instructed jurors to focus on evidence, not labels. After several days, the case went to deliberations. Jurors worked for a little over 2 hours across 2 days, then returned to the courtroom. Their task wasn't to decide who fired the gun. Wink admitted shooting and told the 911 operator that the tenant came after her. Their task was to decide why. Murder, justified force, or a lesser culpability. June 20th, 2025. The clerk read the verdict, guilty of murder and guilty of criminal lockout. Wink stood, face-controlled. A family in the gallery absorbed what the words meant. Outside, the courthouse steps saw the usual clutch of microphones. The state emphasized the recording and the timeline as decisive. The defense promised to appeal. Coverage across local outlets was brisk, The case had blended civic identity with private violence, and that combination carried symbolic weight. Bond after conviction was contested and denied. It was a short, procedural hearing, but it signaled the court's view. The jury's decision stood on a firm record. The case moved to the pre-sentence phase, where both sides gather mitigation and prepare statements. September 5th, 2025. The hallway outside the courtroom smelled like fresh coffee and toner. The benches filled early. Reporters took their places again. When the judge entered, the murmurs fell away. The state asked for a sentence that would send a clear message about landlord-tenant violence, and that would stand for Kurt Lametta's life. Prosecutors re-outlined the months-long conflict, the illegal lockout, the threats, the recording, and the internet searches. One prosecutor called the act a deliberate execution fueled by visceral hatred, repeating the theme that this was not sudden panic. The defense argued for mercy. They pointed to Wink's age, lack of previous violent convictions, mental health stressors, and the corrosive nature of the conflict. Two people trapped in a dysfunctional arrangement during a historic crisis. They reminded the court of community service and asked for a term that left some future on the other side. When the ruling came, it was unequivocal: 50 years in prison. At 65, that is effectively a life sentence. The judge's framing was blunt. This should have been handled in housing court, not with a gun. The sentence tracked the jury's moral finding and gave it legal weight. Press coverage called it a life-equivalent term and noted the symbolic message it carried in a city where the defendant had once steward elections. A formal press release from the Connecticut Division of Criminal Justice followed days later, confirming the 50-year term and the case details for the record. The defense reiterated its plan to appeal. Let's compress the case into a timeline you can hold in your head. 2020 to 2021. Rent falls behind during COVID. Arguments start. The relationship erodes. Warnings are issued about contact. Pre-Jan 2022. An alleged illegal lockout and discarded belongings escalate the situation. Civil process is bypassed. January 20th, 2022. Confrontation at 16 Nelson Avenue. Phone recording captures the encounter. Multiple shots are fired. 911 is called. Kurt is pronounced dead. 2022 to 2025. Investigations and filings. The state builds around the recording, timeline, and searches. The defense builds around self-defense and emotional disturbance. June 2025. Jury convicts Wink of murder after short deliberations. September 2025. Court imposes 50 years. Judge says this belonged in housing court. Appeals are announced. That's the spine. Everything else are ribs attached to it. Emotion, community reaction, the symbolism of a civic official turned defendant, and the quiet, devastating fact that a man recorded his own killing. Jurors aren't asked to be forensic audio experts. They're asked whether evidence persuades beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, the audio did three things. Fix the timeline. Instead of relying on memory under stress, the recording provided a sequence with measurable gaps. That lets prosecutors argue whether force was continuous self-defense or something else. Located people in space. Voices and sounds suggested position and movement. The state argued the victim was not advancing when later shots were fired. That contradicted self-defense claims and undermined the idea of a chaotic blur. Neutralized spin. When two narratives collide, fear versus malice, recordings compress the distance between them. Jurors return to the track and ask, what fits this sound? The prosecution said, murder, that the jury agreed. For viewers, if you've ever wondered why attorneys care so much about seconds, pauses, and order, this is why. A pause can carry intent. That doesn't make every pause criminal, but it changes how jurors hear the moment. This case drew attention not because Norwalk is a media hub, but because identity and power were braided into it. A former deputy registrar of voters, someone associated with rules and procedures, stood convicted of bypassing rules at home and using violence to force an outcome. That contrast sharpened coverage. If the people who run civic process ignore civil process, what does that say to everyone else? That question hovered over the courthouse steps. Victims' family statements focused on Kurt as a person, not a symbol, a man with habits, hopes, and flaws who should have had a civil day in housing court, not a fatal night in a rented room. Prosecutors emphasized deterrence. The defense emphasized context and human frailty. All three can be true at once. Loss, deterrence, and context. Sentencing is where those values collide. The pandemic didn't cause landlord-tenant violence, but it stressed every link in the chain. Moratoriums protected tenants. Some landlords absorbed months of non-payment. Housing courts clogged. Enforcement got messy. In that setting, temptations grow. To change a lock instead of filing, to confront in a hallway rather than document and wait. Those choices don't feel like violence until they're paired with a weapon or with a shove down the stairs. Then they're irreversible. This case serves as a caution with 3 plain lessons. If you're a landlord, use the process. It's slow and expensive, but it exists to keep danger out of small rooms. Every shortcut to force raises risk and, as here, increases criminal exposure. That's not moralizing. It's practical survival. If you're a tenant, document and bring help. You shouldn't have to record to be safe, but documentation changes outcomes. It did here. Community organizations and legal aid clinics can create distance and de-escalate. If you're nearby, don't normalize the pattern. Repeated confrontations are a known risk factor. Third-party presence and early calls change the trajectory. When a judge says this belonged in housing court, it's not a slogan. It's a map for how to keep people alive. After months of hearings and a summer trial, sentencing day still lands like a drop in atmospheric pressure. Everyone knows the number will be large. No one knows exactly how it will sound when said out loud. The judge speaks for several minutes, describing the conflict, the choices, and the law. The courtroom is fluorescent bright. A bailiff shifts his weight, a pen taps and stops. When the judge reaches the conclusion, 50 years, the words push through the silence like a heavy door finally opening. Someone in the second row exhales into a shaky half-sob. The clerk notes the term. A calendar flips forward inside everyone's head. That's the shape of the climax here. Not spectacle, but the weight of time settling on his shoulders. After court, the usual cluster forms outside. Prosecutors call this sentence just. The defense vows to appeal, citing age, mental health testimony, and trial issues to review. The Division of Criminal Justice posts a formal release confirming the term. Coverage across News 12, WFSB, Fox 61, and Hearst outlets converges on the same line. A former Norwalk official received 50 years for shooting her tenant in 2022. The community moves on, but the families don't. Appeals will unfold across months and perhaps years. Briefs, arguments, decisions. Appeals aren't do-overs. They're audits for error. The verdict stands unless a legal flaw is found. Clear stakes in the first 20 seconds. Tenant records. One dies. A city reacts. Linear structure with clean beats you can recount to a friend. A decisive twist. The recording reframes the self-defense claim. A moral question that isn't a trap and invites strong, reasoned opinions. Respectful tone. No glamorization. No gore. Names used with care. Practical takeaways viewers will discuss. Process versus power, documentation, community duty. If this kind of true crime makes sense to you, hit subscribe. We build episodes that treat people like people and facts like anchors. 2 values collide here, and both matter. A. Bright line deterrence. A 50-year sentence tells landlords and anyone in power that civil disputes can't turn violent. Full stop. It protects future tenants by drawing a hard boundary. Go to court, not to the hallway with a gun. Advocates say the term matches the moral harm and honors the victim. B. Context-driven mercy. Years of conflict, documented fear, age, and mental health strain complicate intent. Supporters of a lesser but lengthy term argue justice can recognize risk and still leave space for rehabilitation and aging out of crime. They note the fog of the pandemic changed many people's stability. Where do you land and why? If you were writing the policy for landlord-tenant killings, what would you elevate first? The bright line protection for vulnerable tenants or the individual context of the offender's stress and age. Bring reasons, not heat. Respect each other. The threshold we're guarding now is our comment section.
Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more gripping true crime breakdowns, mysteries, and criminal psychology stories, only on Twisted Case.